The morning sun spilled across the airport windows as passengers hurried through the gate, some rushing with phones pressed to their ears, others clutching coffee cups. Among them was a tall man in a crisp gray suit, walking beside a small boy holding a stuffed blue airplane. The man's name was Richard Langford, a millionaire known for his real estate empire, confidence, and control. But that morning, his steps were slower, his eyes tired. Beside him, his 8-year-old son, Liam, moved nervously, humming softly to himself, eyes darting at the flashing lights and loud announcements echoing through the terminal. Liam was autistic, and though he didn't speak much, his silence often said more than words ever could. When they boarded the first-class cabin, heads turned immediately. People noticed the small boy's odd movements, the way he flapped his hands, the way he avoided eye contact. A woman in a pearl necklace frowned when Liam suddenly covered his ears and whispered something no one could understand. Richard smiled politely, pretending not to notice their discomfort. He had grown used to it, the stares, the whispers, the quiet judgments that followed them everywhere. He helped Liam into his seat, handed him his toy plane, and gave a deep breath as the flight attendants began their pre-takeoff routine. The aircraft began to move down the runway, engines roaring softly beneath their feet. Liam's fingers pressed against the window, his little voice murmuring something about clouds. For a moment, Richard thought maybe this flight would be peaceful. But peace never lasted long. As the plane lifted into the sky, Liam's hum grew louder. He began rocking back and forth, eyes wide, voice rising in panic. The sudden pressure, the roaring noise, the strangers too close, it was too much for him. A sharp cry broke through the cabin. Passengers turned instantly. Liam began screaming, kicking his seat, his toy plane falling to the floor. Richard tried to hold him, whispering, "It's okay, buddy, we're just flying," but it didn't help. The woman in pearls sighed loudly. A businessman removed his earbuds and frowned. A flight attendant rushed over, voice calm but eyes nervous. "Sir, is everything all right?" Richard nodded quickly, embarrassed, though his hands trembled. He's fine. He just gets scared during takeoff." But Liam wasn't fine. His cries grew sharper, echoing through the cabin like glass breaking. A man in the next seat muttered, "Can't he control his kid?" Another passenger whispered something cruel about rich parents who couldn't even manage their own children. Richard's face turned red. He wanted to vanish, to hide his son from their cold eyes. He could buy private jets, private islands, and companies, but he couldn't buy peace for his little boy. Meanwhile, in economy class, far behind the first-class curtain, a 12-year-old boy named Jaden Carter sat quietly in a narrow seat by the window. His clothes were old but clean. His shoes had worn soles. He clutched a cheap backpack that carried all he owned. He was flying alone, traveling to Los Angeles to see his sick mother in a public hospital. Jaden wasn't used to luxury or kindness, but he noticed things, people's faces, the tone of their voices, the fear in their eyes. When Liam's screams reached the back of the plane, Jaden looked up. Other passengers groaned. Someone complained to the attendant. But Jaden didn't frown. He listened. There was something in the boy's voice he recognized, the same fear he used to see in the children his mother cared for at the hospital. She worked in the children's ward, and Jaden often helped her. He had seen autistic kids before, frightened, shaking, lost in a world only they understood. And he had seen how his mother's calm voice and soft humming would help them settle down. He could hear that same sound of panic now, cutting through the hum of the engines. Jaden looked toward the first-class section, separated by a curtain he wasn't supposed to cross. But something in him couldn't ignore it. He took a deep breath, unbuckled his seatbelt, and stood up. A flight attendant noticed him. "Young man, please sit down," she said firmly. Jaden hesitated but then looked toward the sound of the crying again. "That boy, he's scared," Jaden said softly. "I think I can help." The attendant frowned, confused, but before she could reply, the curtain opened slightly, and Jaden saw them. Liam was on the floor, trembling, his small hands over his ears, face wet with tears. Richard knelt beside him, helpless. The boy's toy plane lay broken near his foot. Jaden felt his chest tighten. Without thinking, he stepped forward. "Please, sir," he said, voice low. "Can I try something?" Richard turned, startled by the sight of the poor boy standing there, messy hair, old clothes, eyes full of something calm and strange. "What? Who are you?" Richard asked. Jaden swallowed. "Just someone who's seen this before," he said. The passengers stared. Some whispered, others scoffed. A first-class man snapped, "This isn't your place, kid. Go sit down." But Richard hesitated. For the first time, he saw hope in someone's eyes. "Go ahead," he said quietly. Jaden knelt beside Liam. He didn't touch him at first, he just hummed softly, the same tune his mother used to hum when a frightened child couldn't stop crying. It was slow, like a lullaby carried through clouds. Liam froze for a second, his breath catching. The humming grew louder. Jaden picked up the broken toy plane and handed it to him gently. "It's okay," he whispered. "The plane's just singing, not falling." The cabin fell completely silent. The sound of crying faded into soft hiccups. Liam's eyes lifted, meeting Jaden's. Then, without warning, the little boy smiled, small, uncertain, but real. Richard's mouth fell open. His son hadn't smiled at a stranger in years. For a long moment, no one spoke. The same passengers who had rolled their eyes now sat frozen, watching something they couldn't explain. Jaden didn't look up. He just kept humming until Liam leaned his head on his shoulder and closed his eyes, calm at last. The flight attendant stood near the curtain, speechless. Richard whispered, "Thank you," his voice breaking. Jaden only nodded. He just needed someone to listen, he said quietly. But before Richard could ask another word, before anyone could process what they had just seen, Liam's small hand reached out and grabbed Jaden's, refusing to let go. The plane flew steady and calm, but inside that silent cabin, something had changed forever. And everyone watching knew, this flight would be one the world would never forget. For the next few minutes, the cabin remained quiet, but tension still lingered like static in the air. Passengers whispered behind their hands, their eyes flicking between the rich man and the poor boy sitting on the floor beside him. Richard Langford still couldn't believe what had happened. His son, who never let anyone touch him, now held tightly onto the hand of a stranger. And not just any stranger, a boy who looked like he didn't even belong in first class. Jaden's clothes were simple, his shoes scuffed, his backpack worn thin. Yet somehow, that same boy had done what doctors, therapists, and even Richard himself couldn't do. He had calmed Liam. A flight attendant finally spoke, her voice uncertain. "Sir, perhaps the young man should return to his seat now?" Her eyes darted to the other first-class passengers, who were already frowning again, eager to restore their peaceful luxury. But Liam's grip on Jaden's hand tightened. His fingers clung like vines, small but strong. The boy looked up at Jaden's face as if afraid he would vanish if he let go. Richard looked from his son to Jaden. "It's fine," he said quietly. "He's okay. Just let him stay a little longer." The attendant hesitated but nodded. She stepped back, unsure what else to do. Jaden didn't move. He sat beside Liam's seat, humming softly again, his voice low and steady. The rhythm filled the air like a forgotten song that carried warmth and calm. Liam's breathing slowed. He leaned his head against Jaden's shoulder, eyes fluttering shut. The woman in the pearl necklace sighed dramatically and turned away, muttering, "Unbelievable. Anyone can walk into first class now." A man in a suit whispered back, "You'd think with all his money, he'd control his kid." Richard heard it, but for once, he didn't care. He looked at Liam, peaceful, quiet, smiling faintly, and he felt something inside his chest crack open. Relief. Gratitude. Wonder. He leaned closer to Jaden, speaking softly so as not to wake his son. How did you do that? He doesn't respond to anyone. Not even to me. Jaden looked at him, his expression shy and unsure. My mom works with kids like him, he said. She taught me how to help when they get scared. She says you can't make them stop. You just have to make them feel safe again. His voice was small, but there was wisdom in it, the kind that doesn't come from books, but from love and experience. Richard studied the boy more closely. There was no arrogance in him, no pride. Just calmness. Your mother must be an amazing woman, Richard said quietly. Jaden nodded. She is, he said softly. She's sick right now. That's why I'm going to Los Angeles, to see her at the hospital. His eyes fell to the floor for a moment, and Richard saw the pain hidden there. In that instant, something changed between them. The gap of wealth, of age, of worlds, it all disappeared. Here was a man who had everything, yet couldn't calm his child. And here was a boy who had almost nothing, yet carried a kind of magic money could never buy. The flight attendant approached again, carrying 2 cups of water. She handed one to Richard and, after a hesitant moment, the other to Jaden. Here, she said kindly. You've earned this. Jaden smiled, whispering a quiet thank you. The other passengers tried to go back to their conversations, but they couldn't stop glancing toward the front. They had all seen it, how a child from economy had done the unthinkable. Some felt shame. Some felt awe. But none of them would forget it. A little while later, the captain's voice came through the speakers, calm and steady. Ladies and gentlemen, we're now cruising at 35,000 feet. We hope you're enjoying your flight. But the truth was, no one was enjoying anything. The energy on the plane had changed. The story that had just unfolded in first class hung heavy in everyone's thoughts. Liam stirred and blinked open his eyes. He looked around as if seeing the world for the first time. His small voice came out, shaky but clear, plane okay? Jaden smiled and nodded. Yeah. The plane's okay. Richard froze. His son had spoken words, real words, for the first time in weeks. His throat tightened, and he had to look away for a moment to hide the emotion rising inside him. He whispered, Yes, buddy, the plane's okay. You're safe. Liam turned his gaze to Jaden and smiled again, then reached for his toy plane. It was cracked, one wing broken, but Jaden helped him fix it with a bit of tape from the flight attendant's kit. When they finished, Liam looked proud. He held up the small plane like a trophy. For the first time since boarding, the cabin was filled with something peaceful. Richard sat back, watching them quietly. He couldn't stop replaying what had just happened in his mind. This poor boy, a complete stranger, had walked through a curtain no one else dared to cross, just to help. No hesitation. No fear. No judgment. The pilot's announcement faded, and a soft stillness filled the air. Jaden leaned back in his seat now, sitting beside Liam as the two of them looked out the window together. Below them stretched an endless sea of clouds. For Liam, it was the first time those clouds didn't look frightening. For Jaden, it was the first time he had ever been in first class. Richard watched the two boys and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, hope. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out his phone, and silently took a photo. It wasn't for publicity, or pride, or show. It was a moment he wanted to remember, the moment his son smiled again because of someone who had nothing but heart. As the plane flew onward, the other passengers slowly fell asleep. But Richard didn't. His mind was too full. He kept looking at Jaden, wondering who he really was, and how fate had placed them on the same flight. There was something about the boy, something quiet, mysterious, almost divine. And as the engines hummed in the background, a strange feeling settled over Richard, the feeling that this meeting was not an accident. Something bigger was at play. Something that would change both their lives forever. The lights dimmed. The sky outside was golden with sunset. Liam rested peacefully, his head still leaning on Jaden's shoulder. And as the plane glided through the heavens, no one yet knew that this was only the beginning, that before the flight ended, another storm was waiting for them above the clouds. The plane sailed quietly through the clouds, its engines humming like a distant lullaby. The tension that had filled the cabin earlier had faded into something softer, almost peaceful. Liam was asleep now, still holding his broken toy plane in one hand and Jaden's fingers in the other. Richard Langford sat beside them, staring at the two boys in silence. He couldn't take his eyes off the poor kid who had changed everything in less than an hour. How could someone so young, so humble, do what trained specialists couldn't? The sky outside the window turned gold as the sun began to sink over the horizon. Light danced across the cabin walls, glimmering off the polished seats and silver buckles. Richard took a deep breath, his voice low but filled with awe. "Jaden," he whispered, "tell me, how did you know what to do?" Jaden looked down, twisting his fingers nervously. "My mom," he said softly. "She's a nurse at a children's hospital. I used to help her sometimes." His voice trembled a little as he spoke, like a boy still unsure if adults would listen. "She worked with kids like Liam, kids who see the world differently. Some can't talk. Some get scared when things change or get too loud. But my mom said if you want to help, you can't make them fit your world, you have to step into theirs." Richard nodded slowly, feeling a strange mix of shame and admiration. He had spent years trying to make Liam fit into schools, routines, expectations, even his own pride. He had spent fortunes on specialists, searching for answers. Yet this boy, with no diploma, no degrees, no wealth, had walked in and simply understood. Jaden looked toward the window, his voice quieter now. "When I heard him crying, I remembered another kid from the hospital," he said. "His name was Eli. He used to scream every time his mom left the room. Everyone said he was impossible to calm down. But my mom didn't give up. She told me once, 'Fear is loud, Jaden, but love can be louder.' So I started humming to him. Just like I did for Liam. It worked. Every time." For a moment, the only sound in the cabin was the low hum of the engines and the faint rhythm of Jaden's soft voice as he remembered. There was something in the way he spoke, something pure, like truth unpolished by the world. Richard leaned back in his seat, exhaling deeply. His mind wandered, back to the nights he had come home late, to the arguments with teachers who couldn't handle his son, to the expensive doctors who spoke in big words but gave him little hope. All that time, he had missed what Liam really needed, not perfection, not money, not silence. Just understanding. Just someone who cared enough to listen. Jaden's eyes flicked toward him, noticing his distant look. "You love him a lot, don't you?" he asked softly. Richard turned his gaze to Liam, his heart heavy. "More than anything," he said quietly. "But sometimes I feel like I don't even know how to reach him. Like he's trapped somewhere I can't follow." Jaden nodded slowly. "Maybe you don't have to reach him," he said. "Maybe you just have to sit with him until he lets you in." The words hit Richard harder than he expected. Simple. True. Painfully true. He swallowed, unable to respond. In the row across from them, the same passengers who had whispered judgment earlier now sat silently, pretending not to watch. But their expressions had changed. Some looked thoughtful. Some ashamed. Even the woman with the pearls kept glancing over, her lips pressed tight. She finally leaned toward the man beside her and murmured, "That boy, he's something else." Jaden didn't seem to notice any of it. He was focused on Liam, gently fixing the toy plane again. "You know," he said quietly, "my mom used to say airplanes are brave. They fly even when the sky is rough. She said people should be like that too." Richard smiled faintly. "She sounds like a smart woman." Jaden's smile faded a little. "Yeah, she is. But she's been really sick lately. She's in the hospital in LA. I haven't seen her in almost 3 months. His voice cracked just slightly, and for the first time, Richard heard the weight he carried, the kind of burden no child should carry alone. I saved money to visit her, Jaden continued. I didn't have enough for food the last few days, but that's okay. I need to see her. Richard's chest tightened. He wanted to say something, offer something, money, comfort, anything, but Jaden wasn't asking for help. He was just speaking his truth. And there was something sacred about that honesty. Outside, the clouds darkened as night began to fall. The cabin lights dimmed, and a quiet settled over the passengers. Most were asleep now, their faces peaceful, unaware that something profound had happened in their midst. Richard looked down at his sleeping son, then at Jaden. The boy's head rested against the seat, eyes half closed, exhaustion visible in the soft shadows under them. Yet even tired, there was a light in him, a quiet strength that glowed brighter than all the cabin lights combined. As Richard watched him, a thought came unbidden: maybe miracles don't come from heaven. Maybe they sit next to us in worn-out sneakers and whisper peace into chaos. He turned toward the window, watching the stars blink faintly outside. The flight had hours to go. But for Richard, something had already shifted. The anger, the frustration, the shame, it had melted into something else entirely. Gratitude. And yet, somewhere deep in his chest, a strange unease stirred, a whisper that this moment of calm was too perfect, too fragile. He didn't know why, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the peace wouldn't last. As he closed his eyes, trying to rest, the plane glided on through the dark sky, two boys sleeping side by side, unaware that before the flight ended, everything would change again. The steady hum of the engines filled the cabin as night swallowed the sky outside. A soft glow from the reading lights brushed across Richard Langford's face as he sat there, silent, watching his son sleep peacefully for the first time in weeks. Liam's small hand still clung to Jaden's shirt like a promise he didn't want to break. The boy from economy sat beside him, half asleep, his head tilted against the window. Richard couldn't stop staring, not out of pity, but out of something he hadn't felt in a long time: admiration. He remembered the chaos that had filled the cabin just hours ago, the screaming, the stares, the muttered complaints. People had looked at his son like he was a problem, like he was broken. But now, that same child slept quietly in his seat because of a boy who had nothing, no money, no status, not even a real meal before this flight. The thought struck deep. All his wealth, his success, his power, none of it had ever brought this kind of peace. Richard leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment. Memories he had buried began to surface, uninvited but sharp. He remembered the day his wife, Emily, had passed away, the hospital smell, the cold white walls, and the promise he had whispered over her still hand: "I'll take care of him. I'll make him proud." But he hadn't. Not really. Instead, he had drowned himself in work, chasing meetings, signing contracts, building towers across cities while his son sat in quiet rooms, waiting for a father who was always too busy. A soft sigh escaped his lips as guilt crawled up his throat. He looked at Liam again, the boy who had learned silence because the world didn't listen. He thought about how many times he had told Liam to behave, to act normal, never realizing that his son wasn't misbehaving, he was just trying to survive a world that refused to understand him. The plane shook gently as turbulence rolled through the clouds. A few passengers stirred, fastening their seatbelts again. Richard's eyes flicked to Jaden, who had woken up. The boy blinked sleepily and looked around. "Is it bad?" he asked. "Just a little bump," Richard said, forcing a small smile. "Nothing to worry about." Jaden nodded, but the way his hands gripped the armrest told a different story. The plane jolted again, harder this time. Lights flickered. A nervous murmur spread through the cabin. Liam woke with a sharp gasp, eyes wide, breath quickening. His hands flew to his ears as the seatbelt sign dinged loudly above them. Richard's heart sank. "It's okay, buddy, it's just a little wind," he said quickly, but Liam's panic was rising fast. The calm they had built was breaking apart like glass under pressure. Jaden reached over, placing his hand gently over Liam's. Hey, he whispered, remember the song? The sky's just singing again. He started humming softly, his voice trembling slightly with the movement of the plane. Liam looked at him, terrified, but slowly began to match his breathing with Jaden's. The crying faded to small hiccups. The cabin lights flickered again, casting long shadows. The captain's voice came over the intercom, calm but firm, "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. We're passing through a patch of turbulence. Everything is under control." Richard swallowed hard. He wasn't afraid of flying, he had flown hundreds of times, but this felt different. Not because of danger, but because of helplessness. He watched Jaden holding his son steady, whispering soft words, his small body trembling but unshaken. It hit Richard with the force of a storm. This boy had more courage in him than half the men Richard knew. Minutes passed before the turbulence eased. The plane leveled, and the tension began to fade. Passengers sighed in relief. A few even clapped softly when the seatbelt sign dimmed again. But the cabin didn't return to normal, something unspoken had settled over everyone. They had seen what compassion looked like. Richard exhaled deeply, rubbing his temples. "You're incredible, kid," he said finally, his voice breaking the silence. Jaden gave a shy shrug. "I just didn't want him to be scared." "That's the thing," Richard said quietly. "You didn't just stop his fear, you stopped mine too." Jaden tilted his head, confused. Richard smiled sadly. "I've spent years trying to fix things with money. Problems, people, pain, I thought everything had a price. But tonight, you showed me something I forgot existed." Jaden looked down, embarrassed, and fiddled with the strap on his backpack. "My mom says we don't need much to help someone. Just a little heart." Richard nodded slowly, his chest heavy. "She's right." He leaned his head back, letting out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. The plane was quiet again, but his mind wasn't. Every thought circled back to his son, and the boy who had walked through a curtain of wealth and pride to show them both something real. Across the aisle, a passenger whispered softly to another, "That poor kid just taught a millionaire how to be a father." The words stung, but they were true. As Richard looked at Jaden and Liam sitting together, a sense of regret mixed with awe filled him. He wondered how many moments he had missed, how many smiles had slipped through his fingers because he was too focused on everything that didn't matter. Outside, lightning flashed faintly in the distance, a reminder that storms still lingered beyond the calm. Liam had drifted back to sleep, his hands still wrapped tightly around Jaden's. Richard closed his eyes and let the hum of the engines carry him deeper into thought. He didn't know it yet, but that quiet regret building in his heart was about to become something far greater, because peace never lasts forever. And as another low rumble shook the plane, Richard felt it, the uneasy truth that something else was coming. Something that would test them all before this flight was over. The night sky stretched endlessly outside the windows, painted in deep shades of blue and black. Stars flickered far away like tiny, silent witnesses to what was happening inside the plane. The passengers were resting again, most of them half asleep, comforted by the smooth rhythm of flight after the earlier turbulence. But inside Richard Langford's mind, peace still felt fragile, like glass ready to shatter with the slightest touch. He sat quietly beside his sleeping son and Jaden, who had both drifted off again. Richard couldn't help but watch them, the way Liam's head rested lightly against Jaden's shoulder, the way Jaden's hand stayed protectively near the boy even in sleep. For a moment, Richard smiled. Maybe this flight was meant to happen. Maybe fate had put this boy here for a reason. But peace never lasts long. The plane gave a sudden violent shudder. Trays rattled. Overhead bins creaked. A collective gasp filled the cabin. Then, another jolt, harder this time. The lights flickered, and a cup of coffee slid off a table, splattering across the aisle. Liam's eyes flew open in panic, his small body jerking upright. He pressed his hands to his ears and screamed. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's voice boomed over the speakers, trying to stay calm, "we've hit an unexpected storm system. Please remain seated and fasten your seatbelts. But the storm outside was no ordinary turbulence. The plane rocked again, sharp and sudden, like something was shaking it from the sky itself. Lightning flashed outside the window, bright and violent, illuminating terrified faces across the cabin. Someone screamed. A baby started crying. The woman with the pearls clutched her husband's arm. Richard grabbed Liam, pulling him close, his voice trembling. "It's okay, buddy, it's okay," but Liam was beyond hearing. His screams grew louder, raw with terror. His little hands struck the air, desperate, confused. "Make him stop," a man from across the aisle yelled, his voice cracking. "He's making it worse." Richard turned sharply. "He's just scared," he snapped, but the words came out more desperate than angry. The flight attendants were shouting instructions now, trying to steady passengers as the plane dropped sharply. Oxygen masks swung down. Someone began to pray out loud. Richard's heart pounded. The sound of engines roared through his skull. Then, through the chaos, a small, steady voice cut through the noise, trembling, but clear. "Liam," Jaden whispered. He had woken up, his face pale, his body shaking, but his eyes were calm, focused on Liam. Hey, look at me," he said softly. "It's just thunder. It's not the plane. Remember the song?" Liam didn't respond. Tears streaked his cheeks, and his hands were clamped so tightly over his ears that his fingers turned white. The next jolt threw Jaden forward against the seat in front of him. He winced, gripping the armrest to stay steady. He tried again, louder this time. "Liam!" "The plane's just singing again." Richard turned toward him, realizing what he was doing. "Jaden." But Jaden was already humming. The same soft melody that had calmed Liam before. It was almost impossible to hear at first, drowned by the chaos, the engines, the screams. Yet somehow, that tune began to spread, a fragile sound of calm inside a storm. Liam's head jerked toward it. His breathing hitched. His eyes flickered toward Jaden, who smiled even through his fear. "That's it," Jaden said softly. "It's just a song. You're brave, remember?" Liam's screams began to fade. His shaking slowed. He started to hum back, the sound weak but steady. Richard stared, stunned. Around them, the passengers fell quiet one by one, watching this strange scene, two boys, one frightened and one fearless, facing the storm with nothing but a song. Even the flight attendants paused, their wide eyes softening as they watched. Outside, lightning cracked again, so bright it lit the cabin white for a moment, but inside, for the first time in those long minutes, there was peace. Jaden smiled weakly, the relief washing over his face. "See," he whispered to Liam. "The plane's not angry. It's just talking to the clouds." The turbulence began to ease. The engines steadied. The captain's voice returned, breathless but calm. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've cleared the worst of the storm. Please remain seated as we return to smoother air." Applause broke out from several passengers, short, shaky claps that turned into laughter of relief. Some people even cried quietly. Richard exhaled deeply, his chest tight with emotion. He turned to Jaden, who was breathing heavily, his small body trembling with exhaustion. "You did it again," Richard said softly. "You saved him, and maybe all of us." Jaden smiled faintly. "He's the brave one," he said. "He just needed someone to remind him." Richard reached out and placed a hand on Jaden's shoulder. "You're something special, kid." Jaden gave a small nod, but his face had gone pale. Richard frowned. "Hey, are you okay?" Jaden's lips curved in a weak smile. "Yeah. Just dizzy." And then, without warning, Jaden's body slumped forward. The cup of water in his hand spilled onto the floor as his head hit the side of the seat. Liam let out a frightened gasp, shaking his friend's arm. Jay. Richard's heart froze. Jaden! He unbuckled his seatbelt and caught the boy before he could fall. His body was limp, his breathing shallow. The flight attendants rushed forward, calling for a medical kit. "Sir, step back," one of them said quickly, but Richard ignored her, holding Jaden close. "He's just a kid," Richard said, his voice breaking. "Do something." The cabin erupted in confusion again. Passengers stood, others whispered. Liam began to cry softly, his small hands gripping Jaden's arm. Richard looked down at the boy's pale face, fear clawing through his chest. And as the attendants worked frantically beside him, the same question echoed in his mind, the same question that would haunt him long after this flight ended. What kind of world lets a child give everything, just to help someone else? Outside, the storm clouds faded into quiet skies, but inside the cabin, another kind of storm was just beginning. The air inside the plane had changed. Just minutes ago, laughter of relief had filled the cabin, soft and tired but genuine, the sound of people believing everything was finally okay. But now, silence wrapped around them again, heavy and cold. The flight attendants knelt beside Jaden's still body, their hands shaking as they opened the small emergency medical kit. Richard sat frozen, holding the boy's wrist gently, trying to find a pulse the way he had seen doctors do in movies. He could feel it, faint, almost ghostly, but it was there. "He's breathing," Richard whispered, as if saying it out loud would keep it true. "He's breathing." Liam sat on the seat beside him, trembling. His wide blue eyes were full of tears, his small hands clutching Jaden's arm like letting go would make him disappear. "Why won't he wake up?" he whispered. Richard's throat tightened. "He will, son. He will. He's just tired." But even as he said it, he wasn't sure. The boy's skin had gone pale, almost gray under the dim cabin lights. The attendants were working quickly, one checking his vitals while another tried to clear the area. A woman in the back, a nurse, rushed forward, offering help. The passengers watched in tense silence, some whispering prayers, others unable to look away. The captain's voice came over the speaker again, low and urgent. "If there's a doctor on board, please make yourself known." A man stood up from business class, tall, gray-haired, still in his suit. He moved fast, his calmness slicing through the panic like light through fog. "I'm a cardiologist," he said firmly. "Let me through." The flight attendant stepped aside as he knelt beside Jaden. His trained hands checked for pulse, breathing, response. The doctor looked up after a few seconds, his face unreadable. "He's weak," he said quietly. "Very weak." "Do we have oxygen on board?" They did. The attendants moved quickly to bring the small oxygen mask, fitting it gently over Jaden's nose and mouth. The hiss of oxygen filled the tense quiet. Liam leaned closer, whispering through tears, "He helped me when I was scared. Please help him." The doctor looked at the little boy, then at Richard, and nodded softly. "We'll do everything we can." Minutes passed like hours. Every sound, every beep, every whisper, every breath, seemed to stretch endlessly. Richard couldn't take his eyes off Jaden's face. This boy, this stranger, had walked onto the plane with nothing but an old backpack and worn sneakers, and yet he had done something no one else could, he had reached his son when even he could not. And now, the boy lay still, like he had given every bit of strength he had left to help someone else. The nurse leaned close to the doctor. "His heartbeat stabilizing," she whispered. "Slow, but steady." A soft wave of relief passed through the small crowd gathered near. Richard exhaled, closing his eyes for a moment. He had not realized how tightly he had been holding his breath. "Thank God," he murmured. But as soon as the words left his mouth, he opened his eyes again and looked at Jaden. He was still unconscious. The doctor adjusted the oxygen mask, speaking softly. "He needs real medical attention as soon as we land. I'll inform the captain to prioritize emergency landing clearance." Richard nodded quickly. "Whatever it takes." The captain was already on it. A moment later, the speaker crackled again. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We'll be making an emergency landing in Chicago for a medical situation. Please remain seated and keep calm." The plane began its slow descent through the quiet night sky. Outside, the storm had vanished, replaced by a peaceful darkness lit only by the moon. Inside, though, the tension hadn't eased. Richard sat back, brushing a tear from his cheek as he looked between his sleeping son and the unconscious boy beside him. "Do you know him?" the nurse asked softly. Richard shook his head. "No. I didn't even know his name until an hour ago." He smiled sadly. "But he knew my son's favorite song." "How do you explain something like that?" The nurse gave a small smile. "Maybe some people are just meant to meet, even at 30,000 feet. Liam's small hand slipped into his father's. "Dad," he whispered, "will he be okay?" Richard swallowed hard. "He will, Liam. He has to be." The doctor looked up briefly. "He's a fighter," he said. "You can tell." The landing gear dropped, the sound echoing through the plane like distant thunder. Passengers held their breath as the city lights grew larger below. Richard kept his eyes on Jaden, silently praying. He hadn't prayed in years, but right now, he didn't care about belief or logic, only hope. The plane touched down roughly but safely. The passengers erupted in applause again, though this time it was quieter, unsure. Paramedics were already waiting on the runway. As soon as the doors opened, they rushed in, pushing a stretcher down the aisle. "Step back, please," one of them said, his tone efficient but kind. They lifted Jaden carefully onto the stretcher. Liam clutched Richard's arm, not wanting to let his new friend go. "Wait! He needs his backpack," the little boy cried. Richard grabbed it quickly from the floor and handed it to the paramedic. It was old and faded, but inside was probably everything Jaden owned. "Make sure he keeps this," Richard said firmly. The paramedic nodded. "We will, sir." As they rolled Jaden away, Richard felt something twist inside his chest, something like guilt, something like helplessness. He turned to Liam, whose eyes were full of tears again. "Can we go with him, Dad?" Richard hesitated. The other passengers were already moving out, the crew giving instructions. But when he looked at his son, then at the fading image of the stretcher disappearing down the narrow aisle, he made his choice. "Yes," he said quietly. "We're not leaving him alone." Liam squeezed his hand tighter, and together they followed the paramedics off the plane into the cool night air. The flashing red and blue lights of the ambulance reflected off the metal of the plane behind them. The city skyline glittered in the distance. And as Richard watched the doors of the ambulance close, a strange thought crossed his mind, one that felt impossible to shake. Maybe this boy wasn't just saving Liam. Maybe, in some quiet way, he was saving them all. The ambulance tore through the sleeping city, its siren slicing through the silence of the night. Inside, the flashing red light washed over everything, Jaden's pale face, the tired eyes of the paramedics, and the quiet figure of Richard Langford sitting at the back with his son clinging tightly to his arm. Liam's small face was pale with worry, his eyes never leaving Jaden's motionless body. "Dad," he whispered, "why isn't he waking up?" Richard's voice cracked when he spoke. "He's just resting, buddy. He was very brave on that plane." The paramedic sitting beside them looked up briefly, giving Richard a small, reassuring nod. "We're doing everything we can, sir. He's strong, he just needs time." But time was something Richard wasn't sure they had. The oxygen mask hissed softly against Jaden's face, each breath measured and slow. His small hands, the same hands that had reached out to calm a terrified child midair, now lay limp and still. Richard looked at him and felt a deep ache in his chest. He had seen a lot in his life, business failures, money struggles, even loneliness, but he had never seen courage like this. When they reached Chicago General, nurses and doctors rushed out to meet them. The ambulance doors swung open and the cold night air hit Richard's face as the paramedics pulled Jaden out on the stretcher. Liam tried to follow, but Richard knelt and caught him by the shoulders. "Stay close to me, okay? We're not leaving him." The emergency room was chaos, bright lights, shouting voices, machines beeping in every direction. They wheeled Jaden down a hallway lined with patients, his small figure almost swallowed by the hospital around him. Richard and Liam followed until a nurse gently stopped them at the double doors. "Sir, you can't go past this point," she said softly but firmly. "The doctors need space to work." Liam's lower lip trembled. "But I need to see him." The nurse knelt down and smiled sadly. "You'll see him soon, sweetheart. He's very brave, just like you." Richard took Liam's hand and led him to the waiting area. The seats were cold, the floor shining under the harsh lights. It smelled of antiseptic and fear. Liam curled up in the chair beside him, resting his head against his father's side, still clutching the small paper airplane Jaden had folded for him during the flight. Hours passed. The automatic doors opened and closed, people came and went, but they remained there, silent, waiting. Richard's phone buzzed again and again with messages from business partners and friends, but he ignored them all. For once, none of it mattered. When the doctor finally walked out, Richard stood immediately. The man's face was tired, his scrubs stained faintly from the night's work. Liam jumped up beside his father, eyes wide. "Doctor, how is he?" Richard asked, his voice tense. The doctor gave a faint smile. "He's stable. He's still unconscious, but his heartbeat and oxygen levels are improving. We found signs of exhaustion, dehydration, mild hypoglycemia, but nothing we can't treat." Liam's small voice broke the tension. "So, he's gonna wake up?" The doctor looked at the little boy and nodded gently. "Yes. He just needs rest." The relief that washed through Richard was overwhelming. His shoulders slumped, and for the first time since the turbulence, he let out a real breath. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you so much." The doctor nodded again, then hesitated. "There's something else you should know." The boy didn't have any identification on him, no parents' contact, no address, nothing. "We're trying to locate family, but so far, we've found nothing in our records." Richard frowned. "Nothing? Not even a school card or ID?" "Nothing," the doctor repeated. "Just an old backpack with some clothes, a sketchbook, and a few snacks. We'll keep him here until we can contact social services." Liam's eyes widened. "He doesn't have a family?" The doctor hesitated, then quietly said, "It looks that way." When the doctor left, Richard sat back down slowly, the words echoing in his mind. No family. No one waiting for him. This boy, this brave, selfless boy, had stepped onto that plane alone. Liam looked up at his father. "Can we be his family, Dad?" Richard froze, staring down at his son. The question hit him harder than anything else that night. "Liam," he began softly. "He saved me," Liam said simply. "Nobody else helped. Not even the people who were supposed to. He did." Richard's throat tightened. He looked at his son, the boy who had spent years struggling to connect, to speak, to trust. And yet, here he was, asking to care for someone else. He reached out and brushed a tear from Liam's cheek. "Maybe," he whispered, "that's exactly what we're meant to do." When they were finally allowed to see Jaden, the room was quiet. The steady beep of the monitor filled the space, soft and steady. Jaden lay peacefully on the bed, still pale but breathing easily. Liam climbed carefully onto the chair beside him, his little hand finding Jaden's. "Hey, Jay," he whispered. "It's me." The plane's not loud anymore. Richard stood at the doorway, watching them. There was something beautiful about the scene, two boys, one rich, one poor, one autistic, one lost, both connected by something no one could explain. As morning light began to creep through the hospital windows, a nurse entered with a gentle smile. He's lucky, she said softly to Richard. Most people wouldn't have made it that long without help. Richard nodded. He's more than lucky, he said quietly. He's special. The nurse placed a hand on the end of the bed. When he wakes up, he'll need someone to help him recover, someone to take responsibility for him until social services decide. Richard looked at her, then at the two boys. Liam had fallen asleep again, still holding Jaden's hand. He smiled faintly. You don't have to call anyone else, he said. He's with us now. The nurse looked at him for a moment, then smiled warmly. I'll make a note of that. As she left, Richard stepped closer, gently tucking the blanket around both boys. Outside, the city was waking up, golden sunlight spilling over the skyline. For the first time in years, Richard felt something new inside him, something that money, success, and fame had never given him. It was peace. And as Jaden's eyelids flickered faintly, a small sound escaped his lips, a soft hum, the same tune he had used to calm Liam in the storm. Richard froze, eyes wide. Then, slowly, he smiled. The song, he whispered. He's coming back. The morning sun broke through the clouds, painting the hospital in shades of gold and soft white. It was quiet except for the rhythmic beeping of heart monitors and the distant footsteps of nurses moving through the halls. In one of the smaller recovery rooms, Jaden stirred for the first time in 2 days. His eyes blinked open slowly, the ceiling lights too bright at first. He turned his head slightly and saw two familiar faces, one asleep, one awake. Liam was curled up on the chair beside the bed, his small hand still gripping Jaden's. Richard sat beside them, reading something from his phone but looking up every few seconds, as if afraid the boy would disappear. When Jaden's fingers twitched, Richard immediately leaned forward. Hey, he said softly. Welcome back, kid. Jaden blinked, his voice raspy. Where am I? You're in the hospital, Richard said, smiling gently. You scared us all. Especially him. He nodded toward Liam, who stirred at the sound of voices. The little boy's eyes opened and lit up instantly when he saw Jaden awake. Jay! Liam's voice cracked with excitement. You woke up! He jumped from the chair and hugged him carefully, as if afraid to hurt him. Jaden winced slightly but smiled. Hey, little man, he whispered. Told you I'd be okay. Richard watched them quietly, emotion tightening his throat. He had seen business deals worth billions, buildings rise from dust, but nothing compared to what was unfolding in front of him, two boys, one rich, one poor, one autistic, one broken, holding on to each other like brothers. The nurse entered the room, her face brightening when she saw Jaden awake. Well, look who decided to rejoin us, she said kindly. How do you feel? Jaden shrugged weakly. Like I fell from the sky. She chuckled. That's about right. You had us all worried. She checked his vitals and smiled. You're healing fast. You'll be fine with some rest and good food. When she left, Richard reached into the small bag sitting by the window, Jaden's old, faded backpack. This was all you had, he said softly, pulling it closer. Mind if I ask where you were headed? Jaden looked at the floor, his voice quiet. Nowhere, really. Just going. Going where? Richard asked gently. Anywhere, Jaden said after a pause. My mom died last year. Foster homes didn't work out. I just wanted to see something new. The words hung heavy in the air. Richard felt something deep inside his chest twist painfully. So you were alone? Jaden nodded. Yeah. But it's okay. I got used to it. Liam shook his head fiercely. No, you're not alone. You have us. Jaden blinked in surprise, then smiled faintly. Us? Richard leaned forward, his voice steady but full of warmth. He's right. You have us now. You helped my son when no one else did, not even me. You showed him kindness when the world looked away. That's not something we forget. Jaden looked at him, uncertain. But, you don't even know me. Richard smiled. Maybe not yet. But I'd like to. Liam grinned wide. You can stay with us. You can have your own room and toys and... Liam, Richard interrupted softly, smiling at his son's excitement. Let's take one step at a time. But even as he said it, he knew the truth, his heart had already decided. A few hours later, when the doctors confirmed Jaden could be discharged in a few days, Richard made the call. He arranged for the best pediatric care, new clothes, and even an appointment with a family lawyer. It wasn't about charity, it was about something far deeper. It was about giving back what the boy had already given them. That evening, as the sun dipped below the skyline, Richard sat by the window with a cup of coffee while Liam and Jaden played with a small paper airplane. The same one that had survived the flight, folded perfectly, flying between their hands. The sound of their laughter filled the quiet hospital room, soft, innocent, healing. Jaden looked up at Richard. You really mean it? I can come with you? Richard smiled. If you want to. We'll handle the paperwork, but what matters most is what you want. Jaden looked down at the paper airplane, tracing its edges. I never really had a place to belong, he said softly. But when I sat next to you two, it kind of felt like home. Liam's eyes sparkled. Then it's decided. Richard laughed quietly, shaking his head. You two are impossible. Days passed. Jaden recovered quickly, his energy returning along with his bright smile. The story of what happened on the plane spread everywhere. News outlets ran headlines like "Poor Boy Saves Autistic Child Mid-Flight" and "Strangers United at 30,000 Feet." Reporters wanted interviews, and charities reached out offering help. But Richard turned them all down. This isn't a story for the cameras, he said firmly. This is family. When the day came for Jaden to leave the hospital, he wore a clean shirt and new shoes, a gift from Richard and Liam. As they stepped outside into the fresh air, the city stretched out before them, alive and full of light. Richard turned to him. You ready to start fresh? Jaden nodded slowly, his eyes bright with emotion. Yeah. I think I am. Liam grabbed his hand and pulled him toward the waiting car. Come on, Jay. We're going home. Jaden laughed, a sound so pure that Richard couldn't help but smile. As they drove through the city, the skyline glowing in the evening sun, Richard glanced in the rearview mirror. The two boys were in the back seat, whispering, laughing, making paper airplanes out of the hospital discharge papers. He felt something shift inside him, a quiet, powerful peace that money could never buy. He thought of how it all began, a screaming child mid-flight, a boy no one noticed, and a moment that changed everything. Sometimes, he realized, miracles don't come wrapped in gold. Sometimes they arrive in worn sneakers, carrying nothing but kindness. And as Jaden leaned his head against the window, humming the familiar tune that once calmed a plane full of strangers, Richard finally understood the truth. That night, at 30,000 feet, it wasn't a poor boy who saved a rich man's son. It was one broken heart saving another, and in doing so, healing them both.